Hey everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly Update for June 20. What day is this?
June 25th.
It's June 25th. I'm Kevin Gastola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com, and I've been up till 3 a.m. working on this major development that happened with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's case to cover, which is why I don't know what day it is. But yeah, we've got a lot to get to related to this major development. But first, Brian.
Hey, Kevin. Hopefully we'll get through this without you falling asleep in the middle of your discussions today, but definitely got some good stories to talk about. Just a quick reminder to please subscribe and to follow us on social media so that you know what we're up to. And if you want to support our work, if you like what we do, if you appreciate Kevin's late night reporting sessions, head on over to shadowproof.com/donate. You can chip in a few bucks. We'll send you a tote bag, and we really appreciate your support. Before we get to the Assange reporting that you've been doing, we're going to start with a story here involving climate change. We have as record heat intensifies in the Arctic. Oil industry targets University of Colorado scientists. What's this story?
Many of us may know that there were news reports of it hitting 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia. And meanwhile, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, this group that we've highlighted a lot of their releases because they represent environmental agency employees in the government who are defying the crackdowns on science by President Donald Trump's administration. They put out a release that says that University of Colorado scientists were targeted by the oil industry because they have worked on the impact of U.S. oil and the shale gas boom, its effects on the environment in Colorado and surrounding states. They note in this release that years of continuous readings on climate gases, including methane and volatile organic compounds, which are sometimes called VOCs, they're produced by fossil fuel combustion, will cease. All of these, the sort of emissions from fossil fuel combustion, these readings that they've been taking continuously, that sort of research is in jeopardy because these scientists have been removed or fired. PEER goes on to mention that there's one particular project. There's two projects, but this one in particular I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, which it involves data collection from the National Science Foundation's sponsored field site at Summit, Greenland. And access to the station for a necessary instrument repair trip is only possible during the middle of the summer, according to PEER. And if that trip does not take place during the next 2 months, then an important climate record that started in 2008 will be interrupted. No plans have been finalized to undertake this trip. So just to summarize, as it's pretty clear, the oil industry is attacking our ability to understand the scale of climate change as the threat intensifies.
Thanks, Kevin. Our next story here involves the TSA. We have a whistleblower alleging that the agency engaged in gross mismanagement during COVID-19. What did the TSA do?
Yeah, this one may seem pretty straightforward to everyone. When we knew that COVID-19 was hitting, it's not like our government moved very quickly, and certainly the TSA wasn't taking any precautions. In fact, I came back from covering Julian Assange's 1-week extradition hearing, and I was not asked any questions about COVID-19. I didn't have my temperature taken, even though we already saw the spikes in cases in Italy, and it was really bad in China, and it was just spreading to parts of Europe. But I wasn't asked, even though I was coming from the UK and Europe where COVID-19 was spreading. So the Office of Special Counsel, this agency that looks at whistleblower complaints, says there's a substantial likelihood of wrongdoing, and they have ordered the Department of Homeland Security to look into a TSA federal security director's claims. His name is Jay Brainerd. He was an official in charge of transportation security in the state of Kansas. He's been with the agency for almost 20 years. He told NPR that the leadership of his agency failed to protect its staff from the pandemic. And as a result, TSA employees were acting as quote unquote significant carriers. He says that this meant that travelers were likely becoming exposed to the coronavirus. And Brainerd adds, "We did not take adequate steps to make sure that we were not becoming carriers and spreaders of the virus ourselves. I believe absolutely that contributed to the spread of the coronavirus." And so, we'll follow this. I doubt that this is going to be ignored by the mass media, but that being said, there is a likelihood of retaliation because we've seen President Donald Trump's administration not want to take these precautions and even lie about how certain precautions to prevent the spread of the coronavirus, like testing, might actually be responsible for spreading the coronavirus. And so with an administration that's so anti-science, we can expect that Brainerd is probably going to have a tough time getting his claims validated by the Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move on to our next story here out of Nevada. We have Nevada's OSHA protects businesses while suppressing worker complaints. What is up with OSHA in Nevada?
Yeah, so I wanted to quickly bring this into our conversation because we've highlighted how workers have been facing extreme conditions during COVID-19. And we're looking to states to back up whistleblower retaliation claims and claims of workplace abuse, etc. But in this instance, what this local affiliate in Nevada is exposing is the systemic capture, the total capture, how the business industry has control over what is supposed to be a regulatory agency that looks after workers. There are healthcare workers that are demanding to be heard and protected from COVID-19, but this local affiliate says they're afraid to speak out. One of them, her name is Helen Armstrong, says the system failed her. Her fight actually goes back all the way to 2014, and yet she's still, there's nothing meaningfully different about OSHA during this time. She reported medical safety concerns at a clinic where she was working for decades. Then OSHA documented these violations, but she was still fired. And when she pursued a whistleblower retaliation claim, according to this local news outlet, she was shocked to learn that the Nevada system is in fact set up with the Nevada OSHA agency. This agency answers to the Nevada Department of Business and Industry. So it's not independent. It can't actually act as a check on the power of industry. Nevada is one of about 20 states where the OSHA office is state-run instead of by federal authority. So without having that break, then it's obviously not able to do what it should do when conducting investigations. Her story is one where she talks about how it was essentially blocked. Her efforts to try to get everything she was claiming confirmed were delayed, and then ultimately they claimed that they had timed out, and so she was effectively denied. I think her due process rights were violated, but then she was also denied the ability to have her claims proven by the agency, which the evidence suggests they actively thwarted this healthcare worker's ability to prove that medical safety was not being protected at this clinic.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move on to the Assange stories that we've been talking about here. The first one we have here is that the Assange indictment expands to criminalize WikiLeaks staff who helped Snowden. You were telling me about this just before we started. Why don't you update our listeners?
Yeah, so first, what I want to begin with is to discuss the fact that this grand jury was empaneled for almost for around 10 years, very nearly 10 years, and it was dismissed in March 2020. This was a grand jury in Alexandria, Virginia, that was investigating and, in my view, set out to destroy WikiLeaks. And they were calling people and questioning them as early as December 2010. And so in March 2020, we had an unexpected development, which was that Judge Anthony Tranga, a federal judge, dismissed the grand jury. And at that moment, it looked like the investigation was over because Chelsea Manning was released from jail. She was there for about a year because she refused to testify before this grand jury. Of course, Chelsea is the U.S. Army whistleblower who provided disclosures to WikiLeaks for over 500,000 documents, and she provided this information to them. And then there's Jeremy Hammond, who was involved in the hack of Stratfor private intelligence firm, providing files to WikiLeaks that were published. And he was serving a federal prison sentence, and he was brought to the district, brought to Alexandria, put in a jail, transferred out of Bureau of Prisons custody, and then he refused and was held in contempt as well, just like Chelsea. And ultimately in March, he was returned to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons to complete his sentence. And so this seemed like the end of the grand jury. And then now we get a look at how the Justice Department resolved the issue of not really getting anywhere, in my opinion, in the last few months or the last year of this grand jury investigation. And as it intensified and they brought people together, we see now that really what they've decided to do is rely on their own paid informants, which we'll get to, and then also to expand their theory around the extent of the conspiracy that they allege Julian Assange engaged in by trying to recruit system administrators, trying to recruit people who had access to computer systems at government agencies like the CIA, and going around and speaking at these conferences about whistleblowing and radical transparency, and then also the help that was provided to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden is now explicitly criminalized. You might recall that back in 2013, Edward Snowden was in Hong Kong. This is where Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and Ewan McCaskill all worked on those disclosures that exposed the mass surveillance apparatus that we had. And understandably, WikiLeaks was inspired by what Edward Snowden was doing. People like Sarah Harrison spoke favorably about Edward Snowden, as did Julian Assange. And they wanted to help because, in their view, they thought that The Guardian and some of these other outlets could step up to protect Edward Snowden from prosecution, to help get him to a country that would provide asylum. But they weren't willing to do that. And so Sarah Harrison went to Hong Kong and traveled with Edward Snowden through Moscow. And then in Moscow, they were trapped there because the State Department revoked Edward Snowden's passport, and he was stuck in the airport, eventually applied for asylum in Russia, where he remains today. But that was not supposed to be his final destination. And so this indictment openly goes after WikiLeaks staff for supporting Assange, for supporting Snowden, saying that they attempted to assist Snowden in evading arrest. They know, and for the first time in this case, we have people who are WikiLeaks staff brought into the indictment against Assange. It's no longer about the interactions that Julian Assange allegedly had with Chelsea Manning. It includes this part of the WikiLeaks story, and Sarah Harrison is mentioned. She is WLA-4 in the indictment, and Sarah Harrison is essentially accused of helping Snowden because they wanted to encourage leakers and hackers to provide stolen materials to WikiLeaks in the future. That conflicts sharply with what Sarah Harrison herself said on Democracy Now! In 2016, where she essentially spoke, as I just said, about how The Guardian had refused to give additional help to Edward Snowden so that he would not be prosecuted. And they decided to step forward and try to ensure that Snowden would not get a 35-year sentence similar to what Chelsea Manning received. Actually, at the time, it was a long time ago. It was like 7 years ago, and you may not remember, but at that time, the trial for Chelsea Manning was unfolding simultaneously as Edward Snowden was seeking safety from the United States. So they didn't know what Chelsea Manning was going to be sentenced to as far as her prison sentence. And essentially, they just wanted to make sure that Snowden did not become someone who was detained, held incommunicado, or held in maybe a facility like Quantico, where we recall Chelsea Manning was in fact treated cruelly and inhumanely, and the UN Special Rapporteur of Torture spoke out against that. So they were working to get him a flight to a country. It's noted by prosecutors that WikiLeaks booked flights to India through Beijing and also flights to Iceland to confuse prosecutors or to confuse government officials, make it hard to track Snowden, and they include that as part of an alleged conspiracy. And then where it gets really troubling, not that that isn't troubling, but where it becomes even more alarming is that they start to criminalize the speeches and statements that were shared at conferences, like the Chaos Computer Club conference in Germany. There's a conference called Republica, and they go after Harrison. They name Jacob Appelbaum. He's WLA-3. And then Daniel Domscheit-Berg is mentioned as WLA-2, being at one of these conferences. So their messages are included because, well, really what they're criminalizing is the fact that they were celebrating the success of WikiLeaks thus far in being able to publish this classified information. And so they include this in the conspiracy as if these celebrations are solicitations for individuals to provide information. And Assange does make a statement where he encourages people to provide information to the world. If they're, he says, young people, join the CIA, go in there, go into the ballpark and get the ball and bring it out, with the understanding, with the paranoia that all those organizations will be infiltrated by this generation, by an ideology that is spread across the internet. And every young person is educated on the internet. And then there will be no person that has not been exposed to this ideology of transparency and understanding of wanting to keep the internet, which we were born into, free. So he was trying to convince people that they need to defend the free and open internet through their job. If they see information that threatens the free and open internet, they should follow Edward Snowden's example and reveal that abuse, waste, fraud, and illegality. And what the government is doing is presenting this as basically some kind of a recruitment effort to convince future systems administrators to go get jobs in the government and just constantly purloin caches of documents for WikiLeaks without any purpose. I mean, they completely remove any of the reasons why those documents would be disclosed to WikiLeaks. And by and large, WikiLeaks isn't just publishing data sets for no particular reason from government. They usually want to expose something specific about what that agency is up to, or they go through that data set and they bring out stories from those data sets so that there's something that people can gain from consuming that information. So, but they're criminalizing the way in which this speech is engaged in at Congress. I think that's a really troubling development for anyone who celebrates the kind of transparency journalism that has proliferated in the last 5 to 10 years, largely owed to the impact WikiLeaks had 10 years ago. And so the one other thing I'll say related to the indictment that has been expanded is the section that is getting a lot of press in the media about the hacking conspiracy charges that have been there's more detail now. The timeline now is not just Julian Assange asking Chelsea Manning to allegedly help him crack a password to get into a Pentagon computer. Maybe because defense attorneys were able to blow a hole in their evidence during this 1-week hearing back in February that I witnessed. Perhaps they're now adding extra information that was not part of the extradition request. And I think that there are some reasons to believe that they are moving forward and adding this evidence improperly because they needed to notify the defendant of all of this evidence that was going to be brought against Julian Assange by June 19th. And then the extradition process began, and they've been rebutting the case that they thought the prosecutors were going to bring forward from the United States. But all of a sudden, 2 months or so before this 3-week hearing is going to happen with witnesses, the government is adding an extra veneer of criminality to the conspiracy charge and making it seem like there's something more significant that happened, although it's very vague and overbroad, but they're adding in all of these different details that make Assange's behavior seem more sinister than it really is. And yet in terms of due process, that should have been in the extradition request a year ago, because the defense should be able to rebut those claims by the prosecution without them being added after the fact. None of this is new. All of this information now in there from 2009 to 2015 has been known to the FBI and Justice Department for a very long time. And so they had 2 paid informants. One informant is his name is Ziggy. His name is Sigurdur Ziggy Þórðarson. He's from Iceland. He was 17 when he worked for WikiLeaks, and he was involved in running this chat room and was a point of contact for new volunteers, journalists, potential sources, and outside groups, according to Wired magazine. And he embezzled $50,000 from WikiLeaks. He committed crimes while he was in Iceland. He was broke. He begged the FBI for money. He apparently checked himself into a mental institution. The FBI decided to still try to work with him even after he was fired from WikiLeaks and it was discovered that he was involved in embezzling money. But I think his stability as an individual has been in question because he engages in criminal activity. Also, you have the fact that he is apparently a fabricator, and WikiLeaks has said that there are many things that he's claimed about his work with WikiLeaks that aren't true. Now, the other informant that they have relied upon for the section on hacking conspiracy comes from the timeline that involved LulzSec and AntiSec and Anonymous. And this was the time when these leaks were coming out that were passed on to WikiLeaks about Stratfor. And the individual who was involved in this was Hector, and he was known as Sabu. And Sabu was someone who was also working for the FBI. He was flipped and turned, and then he continued to work. And we know that Sabu from the work of Gabriella Coleman, who wrote in her book Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy. She mentions that Hammond told her that when talking to WikiLeaks, they first asked to authenticate the leak by pasting them some samples, which I did, but they didn't ask who I was or even really how I got access to it. But I told them voluntarily that I was working with AntiSec and had hacked Stratfor soon after he arranged the handoff. And when Sabu found out, he insisted on dealing with Assange personally. After all, he told Hammond he was already in contact with Assange's trusted assistant, Q. So Sabu was constantly trying to get Assange to commit crimes. He even he offered to pay cash for the leaks, but WikiLeaks was already moving on publication of the files, so he wasn't able to get Assange to commit anything that would be prosecutable when it came to paying for the information. And so you've got this in the indictment. There are a few things that apparently happened in chats between Sabu and Assange, allegedly. And I read through them, and there wasn't anything that really grabbed me that completely changes the narrative. But I think it goes towards the character assassination of making it believe that these people who Assange worked with are unsavory characters. They're involved in a violation of private property. They're purloining systems on the internet. They're taking files from these spaces, and Assange is completely okay with that, and he's not telling them to stop. So let's go after him for this and make him seem even more like a criminal and not a journalist by showing that this is who he works with. But they don't have clear evidence in there of him being a participant in the hacking. And what they have is agreement that, they suggest that there's an agreement, and then someone turns around and goes and commits the hack. I think that there's a lot that the defense for him will be able to do to pick that apart and show that no agreement was ever formed. There's a lot of interpretation on the part of prosecutors to say that a conspiracy occurred. And what it comes down to is this is a form of journalism where hackers are sources for potential news stories that the government is essentially waging war against and saying, you're not going to be allowed to produce this kind of journalism. So we saw just in the past week, there was something called DDoS secrets. And this was a trove of files from police departments that showed that they were how they were responding to the protests after George Floyd was murdered. And that involves some people who actually have links back to the era of Jeremy Hammond and AntiSec and LulzSec and Anonymous in 2011. But the publication of these files, this account that was publishing them, was taken down by Twitter. So there's a kind of effort to suppress the publication of hacking materials, even though it is covered by the First Amendment. We saw that with the Podesta files, which is outside the scope of this indictment still, but I suppose we could see another superseding indictment where that was included. And that's protected by the First Amendment, yet for the most part, the government and media establishment has created this way of discouraging us from believing that this information that was hacked can be published and read by us all and be part of freedom of the press. But it completely is. And I would just close by saying that there's a lot to this hacking conspiracy charge that is being repeated in news articles. And it's a way for the Justice Department to make it seem like they're not targeting Julian Assange for journalism. It's just simply window dressing. It gives it this veneer of criminality, as I said, and it's not that subtle. It's very clear that this is a political way to dress up targeting someone for the publication of information. Because if they can position the publishing of information as part of a hacking conspiracy, then they think it's going to be okay to criminalize journalism. So in my view, you can't be opposed to the 17 Espionage Act charges, but think that the one hacking charge is acceptable, and that as long as the 17 go away, you would be all right with Julian Assange being prosecuted with the one charge. The fact is that the one charge is only there to make those 17 other charges seem a little more legitimate, because it's creating a narrative of collaborating with hackers so that Julian Assange isn't seen as a journalist, but is in fact seen as a hacker who is involved in attacking the United States and trying to pierce the security of the system that is supposed to protect state secrets.
Thank you, Kevin. That's an excellent explanation. I really appreciate that. And it seems like the folks in our YouTube comments are engaging in a lively conversation. So I think very good job there. Before we wrap today, anything that you would like to, any final words on the stories today, or anything looking ahead to the next week or the next few weeks that you want to share with people?
So there is one thing that I wanted to add. It's about the Chelsea Manning, who was, she's a hero. I mean, she's withstood so much and resisted and never said a word to the grand jury about any of this. But I've had this open question in my mind about why was she kept in jail? What were they doing? And why was it that they weren't willing to let her out of jail? Because everything that we think we know between her and Julian Assange came out during the trial, which I covered extensively 7 years ago. And I followed the court-martial very closely. So I know what was brought out during the pretrial hearings. And I always wondered, what don't they like? I thought maybe they were trying to get her to speak so that they could impeach Chelsea Manning and show that her statement, which she gave to the court when she pled guilty to some offenses, was false, or that she wasn't consistent in that statement. I thought they wanted to pick it apart, find some way that they could undermine the case that Assange's defense was trying to bring. That would include statements from Chelsea Manning herself. And that was kind of brought out by that 1 week hearing. We wrote about this at Shadowproof. You can go back and find the report if you would like to know a little bit more about this. In this indictment, though, they now include Chelsea in this alleged part of this conspiracy. It's under C on the 10th page. It says teenager, Manning, and NATO country 1. And NATO country 1 is Iceland. And they make it out to seem that Chelsea was involved in this conspiracy because, as it says, on March 5th, 2010, Assange told Manning about having received stolen banking documents from a source who, in fact, was Teenager. Teenager is Ziggy. On March 10th, 2010, after Assange told Manning that Assange had given an intel source a list of things we wanted, the source had agreed to provide and did provide 4 months of recordings of all phones in the parliament of the government of Iceland, Assange stated. So that's what I think the future is like. And then there's a winking emoticon referring to how he expects WikiLeaks to operate. And then it says in early 2010, a source provided Assange with credentials to gain unauthorized access to a website used by Iceland to track the location of police, first responder vehicles, and agreed that Assange should use those credentials to gain unauthorized access to the website. It doesn't say who this person is, and I don't really know. On March 17th, 2010, Assange told Manning that Assange used the unauthorized access to the website of Iceland for tracking police vehicles to determine that Iceland police were monitoring Assange. So Iceland police are spying on Assange. On March 29th, 2010, WikiLeaks posted to its website these classified State Department materials. Okay, so as it goes on, and I don't really have to keep reading, it's clear that they've lumped Chelsea Manning into what's going on between Ziggy and Assange, and they've positioned her as part of this conspiracy. And she says nothing about this part of her interactions with Assange in her statement to the court. I don't remember any of this coming up during the court martial, and this is probably what they wanted to ask her about during the grand jury. And they probably believe that there was something that Manning could say that could be used to bolster this conspiracy. See, they're falling back on their own paid informants because I think, during any trial that they put on, they want to show off what they were able to do. The FBI, Brian, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, but law enforcement wants to show that they were able to groom someone like Sabu and then someone like Ziggy and show that they were able to get these great pieces of information that are going to help nail Julian Assange during this trial. I mean, this trial, if it would ever happen in the United States, would be quite a spectacle. And not only would we want to be trying to defend freedom of the press, but on the flip side, law enforcement would be wanting to show off all the different ways they have to target and destroy organizations that are involved in this kinds of journalism. And they would do so by trying to razzle and dazzle us with how they worked Ziggy and made him a paid informant, and how they turned Hector or Sabu into someone who was trying to help them nail Assange. So I think that this thing is, they wanted to develop an indictment that relies on information that they've been collecting all along, and they think that if the case is difficult to make, but at least they can rely on people who they've been manipulating and controlling for the last decade.
Thank you, Kevin. Is that a good place to leave it for you? Or any
that is a good place.
Okay, cool. Well, before we part, I just wanted to thank everybody out there for watching, encourage them to subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on social media. We've also been in the process of collecting pitches right now on the subject of police and prison abolition, things that we have touched on this show and we touch on in our reporting at Shadowproof. We'll be putting up a donation ask to fund that reporting in the near future. But in the meantime, you can go and check out the open call, see the kind of stories that we're going to start publishing. We just greenlit two of them this week. We're really excited about it. So yeah, head on over to shadowproof.com/donate if you can give even just a couple bucks. That'll help us put that money in the pocket of our freelancers. So thank you, everyone. Kevin, go get some sleep. Great work. And we'll see you next week.